Welcome to the conference, Amplification 2020. I first would like to make some acknowledgments. Usually we wait until the end to say thank you, but I like to start with saying thank you to our Central Office Administrator, Jeannie Biaf, to our Student Delegate Liaison, Dr. Veronique Thompson, who has been doing this for a long, long time and has mentored and shepherded many students through our organization. I'd like to thank my institution for their sponsorship, to the Department of Communication and my administrative team. Thank you to our Conference Planning Committee, Kelly Johnson, who's the chair, Terry Davis, and Brenda Nash, who are the most amazing Conference Planning Committee ever. So thank you. Let's see. I also would like to thank the Executive Committee of NCSPP. Thank you for your support, for your leadership, your guidance. We have worked together as a very good team, and I look forward to completing the year with you. Thank you to our past presidents who have volunteered to lead work groups with our Diversity Committee leads. We really appreciate your presence and being here. I'd like to say that we're gathered today on the occupied territory of the Louisianos and Dieguenos Indians, who have stored this land for generations until the Spanish arrived. Welcome to your conference. You are the centerpiece of this conference. We will work together to augment social change and social responsiveness in curriculum, program development, and practice. You will be able to answer some of these questions about social responsiveness. What is social responsiveness? What does it mean for a professional organization, for our students, for training? And you will also play a central role in amplifying excellence in professional psychology through your participation in our social media campaign, your I Am NCSPP testimonials. And at the end of this conference, we hope that we will be able to develop some talking points for social responsiveness. There's a draft in your folder, as well as the social responsiveness training matrix. This is the work of your work groups. So I'd like to say a little bit about amplification. I tell a lot of corny stories, so here's one. So a jewel thief heard that a buyer was coming into town to purchase the most expensive jewel in the state. He shadowed the buyer, and he could not find the jewel, and he was very good at his craft. So he finally was so bothered by this, he confronted the jeweler, and he says, I've done everything I can to find the jewel. And where is it? What did you do with it? And so the buyer finally said, I hid it someplace you would never look for it, in your own pocket. Many times we're searching and looking for validation externally, when what we value is right here. The question is, how do we amplify what we value? Who are we? And what is the work that we do? So here is to who we are as an organization. In the past decade, we have produced over 10,000 psychologists, licensed psychologists. We are located across the US, as you can see on the map. We do have to do something about the middle of America. And in 1 year alone, we conferred 1,576 degrees. This fact sheet is in your folders, and I do hope you share it with your institution and with others. So the title of my talk this morning is Socially Responsive, From Othering to Belonging. Today I wish to offer a few remarks about this, and I'd like to start by saying in preparation for this talk, I look back through my scholarship, my records, to see what did I write about and what do I care about. And I noticed a theme sort of emerged about empathy, compassion. I've given talks about it on the TED stage, and I've given talks about it at institutes and training communities. So I started to reflect on this and realized that they're very much aligned with my personal values. I also said, till this moment, I've never really knew myself. I do realize I'm speaking to a group of psychologists, so. But seriously, the capacity for self-reflection is one of the benchmarks of a developing psychologist. Self-reflection leads to increased awareness that recruits the energy we need to make change. Action to change our circumstances. And in this spirit of self-reflection, I will share with you two more stories that will illuminate for you why social responsiveness is very near and dear to me, and why the theme of this conference is augmenting social change. So the first story I'll share with you is about the almshouse. So the almshouse, I'm from Guyana, South America, and I was raised by my grandmother, who's pictured here. And when I was a little girl, she would take me to visit the almshouse. The almshouse was a poor home for the indigent. We did not have much, but she offered and shared what she had, what little food, prayers. She even had us performing, hence why I love the stage, not really. But performing and singing to bring some sort of lift to people's spirits. And it was there that I became aware of mental health issues and became sort of really captivated by it. My grandmother always said, it was more blessed to give than to receive. Empathy and compassion were values I learned from my grandmother. My grandmother made unreal others real. For her, the other belonged. My second story is the Barrel Child. I don't know how many of you are from the Caribbean, so you may know this story. But the Barrel children are children who are left behind by their parents who are seeking a better life abroad. This child, whose mother suddenly leaves one day to travel abroad, and comes occasionally, maybe once every 2 years. But what is consistent is the barrel she sends. The barrel has clothes, food, foreign food, and the most memorable thing about that barrel is the smell. It smelled foreign. Her mother comes one day and takes her away to that foreign smelling place. As a child, this experience certainly created some anxiety around separation and loss and required acculturation and assimilation to a new home. However, this child was the envy of all her cousins and relatives and was deemed blessed to have had this opportunity. She had better be successful. That child is me. Now, I'm acutely aware that I'm sharing this in a room full of psychologists again, but I think being vulnerable is important. What are the assumptions that we make about immigrants? How do we prepare our students to appreciate the multiple contexts that intersect and shape the history of the individual? How do our students recognize strength amongst vulnerability? Are our students aware of critical writers like Fanon, who offers a framework for understanding the Black experience in his book, Black Skin, White Mask? Fanon also looks at the way Black people respond to a social context that racializes them at the expense of our shared humanity. Or are our students aware of Maori scholars like Linda Smith, whose book, Decolonizing Methodologies, interrogates the way research has been used to subjugate indigenous people? And when we think of interventions, are our students aware that humanistic psychology emphasizes looking at the whole individual and stresses concepts such as free will, self-efficacy, and self-actualization? I would like to share with you my moment about social responsiveness, and I'm hoping that you will share your stories as well. This way, my vision is that we amplify the voices of professional psychology, because I believe this is unique to professional schools of psychology. So I'm responsive to the needs of children and youth who are adversely affected by abuse, poverty, and other social factors that interferes with their emotional development. Children face difficulty accessing mental health care due to lack of trained professionals. And in response, I'm working with my university to develop a state-of-the-art treatment center and institute for child, youth, and adolescent behavioral health that will help to train professional psychologists who have a social imperative to meet mental health needs of the underrepresented children and youth in the U.S. Thanks to a donation from major donation from a donor, we're making this possible. What about you? What about your students? What can we do to prepare them to be socially responsive? So a good place to begin is to look at what does social responsiveness mean for our professional organization. And I will tell you yet another story. So I heard a story about this golden Buddha. At one point in history, the statue was covered with a layer of stucco and the colored glass to conceal its true value. And it remained in this condition for almost 200 years. During relocation of the statue in 1955, the plaster was chipped off and the gold revealed. Tara Brach, who is a Buddhist psychologist, talks about remembering the gold in each other. This allows us to recognize and value our humanity. So regardless of the external covering, how do we remember the goal? And that's what I believe social responsiveness is about. It's about teaching our students how to deliver effective healthcare service, health psychology services that recognizes the value of human diversity. Now, in your folders, you will see some talking points about social responsiveness, and I hope that you can use that in your work group to guide your conversations. In each of the work groups, we will be focusing on, what are the social responsive goals in our current benchmarks, DALs and IRs? What social responsiveness goals can be added to the training domains? And what are the knowledge, attitudes, and skills of our students at the pre-internship and pre-practicum levels? Finally, we hope to complete a social responsiveness training matrix that we can share with other training councils at our combined meeting in the fall of 2020. So I have shared with you at the beginning of my address my reflections on how I arrived at a socially responsive agenda. My vision for NCSPP is to amplify our commitment to training socially responsive psychologists, much like other professions do and other fields, whether it's sports, the arts. This is just a synopsis, a quick snapshot of the headlines, and you can see how these different disciplines are using their platform to speak up on what matters to them. I believe as a professional organization, we can do the same. I'd like to close by saying a little bit about othering. I said social responsiveness is about moving from a space of othering to a space of belonging. So here he's saying in this little cartoon, we are a very tolerant society, but if you don't behave like us, you can go back to where you bloody came from. Now, in terms of othering, I believe accomplishing social responsiveness in our profession begins with a recognition of our natural tendency to see difference as a threat and to prefer sameness. This works for the survival of our species. It's in our DNA. However, an aversion to difference does not make for a thriving society. History has shown us what atrocities are born, and we don't have to look very far. We can look at what's happening right here in our own communities. So, given our natural tendencies towards othering, seeing those who are different as bad, or even neutral, and having a neutral stance can lead to passivity, we have to work to cultivate a sense of belonging. This is a quilt, which is a long collaborative textile art project that portrays the human family and was developed by Esther Bryan in Canada, an artist in Canada. And I think it captures what we're trying to say in this conference. Some of my thoughts is that we can accomplish a sense of belonging by establishing a feeling of safety, engaging in contemplative practices, looking at our professional community as facilitative. You know, we as professionals are privileged, but we don't have to use our privilege to perpetuate the difference and the separation. We can facilitate a sense of belonging. And finally, to widen our circle of belonging. Start here at the conference. Make friends with someone who's different from you. Start in your institutions. Have student body that's diverse and representative of our society. Look at the colleagues in our departments. Are they diverse? Are they different? Or are they the same? And if you have the opportunity to look at your institutions, I'd like to end with a quote from Albert Einstein, of all people. A human being is a part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Thank you.
It is my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, Dr. Stephan Bradley. Dr. Bradley is the chair of the Department of African American Studies at Loyola Marymount in Los Angeles, just down the road, and was the past chair at St. Louis University. Dr. Bradley writes in the preface of his latest book, Upending the Ivory Tower, "In my years as a student and a scholar, I have learned that those who work in universities or colleges are experts in the arena of discussion. They talk about ideas of fairness and liberalism and equality, but implementing justice in the academy is much more difficult to do." While his book traces the history of Black students and administrators at Ivy League institutions, this idea of talking being easy and doing being difficult is truly at the heart of our conference this year. We need to be the change agents. We need to walk the talk of being socially responsive, and we need to engage our students in doing the same. Dr. Bradley also notes in his book, everything is written in a moment, and the moment informs how the history is written. It certainly feels like we are in a momentous moment, if I can be redundant. It's a momentous moment, both in the history of our country and in the path of our profession. Speaking of moments, on the night of November 24th, 2014, Dr. Bradley was giving an interview on MSNBC from the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, in the aftermath of the non-indictment of Officer Darren Wilson in the killing of Michael Brown Jr., an interview that he abruptly ended as the chaos of the moment literally threatened his own safety. Half a world away, my daughter, a student at SLU at the time and studying abroad, was watching. She knew immediately that he had much to teach and that she had much to learn. And she rearranged the rest of her curriculum to take as many of his classes as she could. It is not an exaggeration to say that Dr. Bradley's mentorship shifted the trajectory of her life, and in turn, now mine. So it is my most sincere hope that as you listen to him this morning, and as we begin our work today, that he shifts your trajectory also. So please welcome my dear friend, Stephen Bradley.
You can't do introductions that way. You have people crying, I'm up here. You can't do that. It's wonderful to be here with you all today. Let me say this as I prepare to go with you all. Let me say this. I appreciate, if you don't get anything from what I'm saying today, I appreciate the work you're doing right now in this moment. As Dean Conway said, I realize I'm talking to a group of psychologists. And I know I'm not supposed to say these kind of words, but it's a crazy moment right now. It's nuts. And we need you more now than ever before. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for the work that you do. Let me say this. I have to thank the most important people in the room. And that means the people who set up the chairs, the people who served you your coffee, the people that sliced up those cantaloupes out there, the person that made the microphone work. Those are the working people that make magic for us every day, and sometimes we forget. Next, I'd like to thank the fearless leader, our Queen Dean, Dean Fran Conway of Rutgers University. I've gotten the opportunity. I have the opportunity to know Dean Conway, and this is what I know: is that I want to be like her. I want to be like her, and so we need 1,000 more. I figure we can do it in the United States. If we had 1,000 more Dean Conways, I think we might be all right. Just 1,000. What? There's 380 million people. I figure we can pull it off with just 1,000. And so thank you for your service. Thank you for your work that you're doing for the organization, but you're doing in general. I'm just now learning the details about your center that you're putting together. That's beautiful, just beautiful. Then I have to thank my second favorite person from Louisville, Kentucky. Chair at Spalding University. We call her chairperson, we call her professor. I'm talking about Brenda Nash, who some people call Mama Nash. And if you really want to get down, then you can call her Mama Nashty. Mama Nash did me a favor because she lent me her daughter for about a year and a half or so. I had the high privilege of teaching Mama Nash's daughter. I had the high privilege of mentoring Mama Nash's daughter. I had the high privilege of protesting racism and classism with Mama Nash's daughter in the streets of St. Louis and in Ferguson. But best of all, I had the privilege of following Mama Nash's daughter, Sarah Nash, when the time was right. So I say without mixing any words up that Nash women are fierce, and you should follow them. And so I'm in tow. So yeah. And then lastly, let me thank you all for being out here in the morning time. I know it was really rough to wake up looking at the hills. I know it's hard seeing the palm trees. I know it was very difficult. And so thank you for braving the elements to be out here with us today. Thank you so much for that. And I was serious when I said this before, but the work you're doing, in my opinion, is essential to national security at this moment. And I don't say those words lightly, to national security at this very moment. And I'm not talking about the need for one of you all to address the mental health crisis that's occurring at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Forgive me for that. Look, my rule is to talk like nobody's ever going to invite you back, and so here I am. But what I'm referring to is the need for us to address the trauma that our youth and marginalized people are experiencing that manifests itself in at worst, violence and suicide and the mistreatment of others, but also in small things like feelings of imposter syndrome and feelings of inadequacy. You all are dealing with this. Let me be clear. I believe mental health professionals like yourselves have the greatest potential to advance, and I don't mix words with this either, to advance or impede progress for this nation at this moment. The psychological field in general has done well to advocate for what is right. It's confronted things like gun violence, the caging of human beings, toxic masculinity, and other pressing societal issues. The field has advocated for ethical and scientific reasons why policies should reflect the best of humanity. I'm very thankful for that. And they did so because it was ethical, not political, but because it was ethical. And that's something to be proud of. And I say the psychologists have been in the vanguard in that way, and I'm glad to be standing before you today. So thank you for letting me stand before you. As you can tell, I come from the Baptist tradition. That was the introduction. I forgot to tell you that I get 3 conclusions in the Baptist tradition. You know, I've attended and worked at Catholic institutions where, you know, hey, 1 hour is 1 hour. I like it, you know. So I'm especially happy to be at the conference at NCSPP today because it coincides with the celebrations of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, and that's super. And so I wanted to see who's awake today. I realize it's morning time, so let's find out who's awake today. Let's see. I had some questions here. Look at this. I'm rich. I got $1. If somebody can tell me where Martin Luther King was born and reared. Where was Martin Luther King born and reared? Buddy, give it to me now. Raise your hand. Who? Atlanta. There you go. Mama Nash, can you get this back? There she goes, right back there. Get her. Yeah, you got to get her money. All right. Nicely done. Okay, we're rocking and rolling. Let me see what else I got $5 for a little bit of a harder question. They're turning up, these questions, okay? I got $5 if somebody can tell me what was the name of the undergraduate institution from which Martin King graduated. Let's go right here. Come on, Mama and Dad. Look. I don't know. All right, let's rock and roll. Let's play for some real money. Let's do it. Let me see. I got a 20. If somebody can tell me what was Martin Luther King Jr.'s original name? Who said it? Come get this money. She was absolutely right. Michael King was the name of Martin Luther King and his father. His father, believing in the rebellious and revolutionary spirit of Martin Luther, went ahead and made that change. It's quite a move. It's quite a name to live up to. So let's be clear about this. Now you know that history is my bread and my meat, and if I don't do history, I don't eat. Some of you were like, you must not do a lot of history, because I get it. But you don't want to deal with this 150 pounds of thunder. This is it. Look at these. If I said to raise your hand if you love Martin Luther King, likely most everybody in the room would raise their hand. But the truth is, when he lived, most people didn't love King. I think we have to look at King soberly. And this is important because I think people forget how history is made, how change is made. People don't understand how racist policies go away. There's no amount of politeness that will change a racist policy. There's no amount of patience that will defeat slavery or Jim Crow or mass incarceration. These things become annoying. These things become bothersome. These things become intrusive. That's how change works. This is where you come in. The day after Martin Luther King Jr. died, maybe the day after, maybe the next 2 days after, there were all sorts of, you can look on the internet for these, but there were all sorts of articles about how terrible it was that Martin Luther King was killed. And all sorts of people who had not necessarily been outwardly friendly to Martin Luther King were mourning his death when he died. That was too much for one of King's most trusted allies. Allies, that's the wrong word. Most trusted accomplices. You see, getting free in the 1950s and 60s was illegal because Jim Crow was legal. Because these all-white primaries were still legal. So getting free was illegal. So this was one of his most trusted accomplices. And that's what I hope you all will be in this moment where being free and staying free and getting free could somehow be illegal. We need accomplices more than we need allies. This is what this person said. And I'm going to tell you who this person is so that we don't have any misconceptions about what change looks like. This person was America's triple threat at the moment. He was black, he was gay, and he was socialist. You couldn't have been three worse things in 1968 in America if you tried. His name was Bayard Rustin. If you haven't heard of him before, then do the Googles. One of the most essential at the moment, and he ended up having some problems later on in life, but one of the most essential at the moment strategists with regard to the Black freedom movement. But when his friend was killed, and all of a sudden he saw good liberal people crying and carrying on about how terrible it was that King was dead, he said, "Tears are cheap. Action, alas, so dear." Tears are cheap. Action, alas, so dear. Ooh, doggy. I didn't come here today to ignite your guilt. It does nothing for me, I promise you. But rather to invoke your action. And so I need to know, or better yet, you need to know, who's the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. of your unit, of your department, of your division, or of your institution. If it's you, then what's your next action? If it's not you, then do you support the Martin Luther King of your unit, of your division, of your institution? Now, here's the next question is what does action look like for you? And let's be clear about this too. Not everyone is made for action. Not everybody is about that action, okay? Some would rather support, and that's a good place to be. Some would rather observe from the way, way back, and then cry afterwards when tragedy occurs. Who are you going to be? Who are you going to be? For those of you inclined to take action, you have to approach things the same way that Martin Luther King did. And that starts with exercising power over the things that you control. First thing you can control, bless you, first thing you can control is the action to say yes, is the ability to say yes. It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing. King did this when activists in Montgomery in 1955 were trying to determine who would be a leader for the bus boycott that Rosa Parks kicked off. By the way, when you learn about the bus boycott, everybody will talk about Martin Luther King. You know who was the real heroes of the bus boycott? It's those washerwomen who walked miles to go to work, whistling and singing. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Those are the heroes. Well, I'm not supposed to be talking about that. I'm here to talk about something else. King agreed to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association, even though he probably shouldn't have, and I hope this story resonates with some of you all. He probably shouldn't have. He was too young. He was 26 years old. Now that you're here, would you trust a 26-year-old? He was too young. He didn't have any experience in leading anybody's movement. He had a new wife, had a new baby. And listen to this, Jack. Most importantly to this story, he had a new job. We don't have a whole bunch of time, but somebody asked me at some point or another in life how he got his job at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He is a humbug, definitely. But he had a new job, so he shouldn't have taken this. In the colloquialism of the streets, he had plenty of ish to lose. Sorry for my language. Mama Nash told me to say it. So look here, him offering his services and his church was an incredible risk. But risk is the first step towards justice. The first step towards justice. By the way, did I mention he had a car? Think this through. He was going to lead a bus boycott. King never had to ride a bus. Why would he care about a bus boycott? He had a car. This is my point. This is my point, is that he was privileged. And this is the part they never talk about Martin Luther King. He had been privileged since birth. His daddy was a pastor. Everybody knows the pastor's kid is privileged. Everybody knows that. He lived in one of the best parts of Atlanta. He went to Morehouse College because he couldn't go to the University of Georgia because that was segregated, of course. But in terms of black America, Morehouse College was as high as it goes. Spell House, there it goes. All right. He didn't have to do all of this. Martin Luther King was a fraternity man. He had a PhD. You mean he's going to lead a movement of people that ride the bus to work? I hope you're understanding this and what this means for you, what this means for me. There was a moment when I struggled to say yes. Mama Nash referred to it. Mama Nasty. When I found out that Michael Brown Jr. had been shot by police in Ferguson, Missouri. I felt terrible for him and his family. I felt terrible for the community out there. I had been doing engagement work out in Florissant, Ferguson, Jennings, out there in North County, St. Louis. And so I wasn't new to the area, and I wasn't new to the idea of service. That my father retired from the U.S. Army, Command Sergeant Major. He was a combat veteran, so this idea of sacrifice and service are regular things. My mama fed an entire neighborhood. That's what she did. They grew up in the Jim Crow South. And so when they came north, they made community. So I understood what it was. I'm no stranger to community, but when confronted with the prospects of taking street action, I'm not sure I was prepared. You see, I had a baby girl who was no more than 6 months old. I had a good job running an academic, bless you, I had a good job running an academic unit at a good university. And I had a reputation as being a respectable leader in the community. They give me awards and things like that. The truth is, my anxiety about it, my hesitance was me being selfish. It was me being selfish. I thought I had something to lose. I wasn't thinking about the way that black psychology and black studies started. It started on the Wee-Uzi model. You all don't know that one, do you? Look, I'm here to teach today, Jack. The Wee-Uzi model. That's the we, us, I model, in that order. We, us, I. I was thinking about I. I got a little girl. I got a good job. I got a reputation. I wasn't thinking about we and us. And I was ashamed of that. We talking about moments of vulnerability? I was ashamed of that. And everything changed when I got a call in the middle of the night. My student was pepper sprayed, tear gassed as well, and shot with rubber pellets. Another student was calling me on the telephone telling me this. He said such and such was shot. This is one of Nasty's friends. Such and such was, all I heard was shot, the shot with the rubber pellets part. I didn't know it was rubber pellet. And I'm like, what? Somebody was shot? I start reaching for my knife. We going to handle this. It didn't make sense. But these young people of mine, these students of mine, were out protesting police response to the community assembling in their neighborhood. My student's partner picked him up and carried him to another mentor's house where they tried to rinse the tear gas and the pepper spray out of his eyes. And off his body, it stung. When I talked to my students, I said, well, listen, hey, you know I teach the Black Freedom Movement course, and I taught all you all. I know you care about justice and this kind of thing. You don't have to be a martyr. It's okay. Don't go out anymore. They said, Professor Bradley, we're sorry, but we're going to be out tonight. This was the next day. I said, no, please, really. We get it, and you proved your point. He said, we're going to be out. I said, well, if you're going out, then I'm going to be out with you. And I knew better than to think that I had some kind of original idea that I was going to lead a movement or anything like that. No, I did the smarter thing, and I followed these young people who were brave enough to holler like hell when they saw injustice. By then, to use the phrase that from Assata Shakur that young people were chanting on the streets, by then I had nothing to lose but my chains. I was Somebody called me a community leader of sorts. I was the director of an African American Studies program and an historian who had taught hundreds of students about black freedom. Simply put, it was my duty to go and stand with the people at that moment. And because I had spent my professional life researching the activism of youth, by the way, I'm selling copies of my book in the back, $25. I take Social Security, I take... We'll just sign the back of it. It's no problem. I got it. Because I've written about the role of youth in changing life and improving life for others for my entire career, I knew that it didn't make sense for the old people to try to jump out in front of this movement, that the young people had to lead this movement. Now, this is an important element, and you all understand this probably best of all. These young people had no experience in leading a movement. They were bound to make mistakes. They were bound to be annoying. This is important. Shutting down a freeway is annoying. Closing down a shopping mall is annoying. When you got to shop for your kids' Christmas. On the freeway, you're trying to get to your kid's daycare or to pick up your kid from the babysitter. That's annoying. But how do you think freedom gets made? How do you think it happens? You think it's the beautiful letters that are written? Hey, look right now on TV and see how freedom is being made. One of the demands when I'm talking about this scholarship of mine, one of the demands of particularly students of color in the 1960s who were protesting at their institutions. These were some of the first black and other students of color who got into these institutions. They started protesting against their predominantly white institutions, and one of the key demands was they wanted mental health professionals of color to speak to. Today, students protest for the same things. I ask you, how are you making mental health professionals available for these students? One thing I knew is I had to use what little piece of power I had. I had resources from my department, and I had my voice as a scholar. So first, my voice. News outlets from around the nation and the world were contacting me, wanting to hear what I had to say about things. I'm talking about BBC and The Guardian. I'm talking about Le Monde, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times. One of the things that I did is I made the decision to always center youth in whatever interview, whatever I was going to talk about, to always center youth. That was the first thing that I made the decision about. The youth who were being traumatized. And I hope you understand this, who were being traumatized by the helicopters that were in their neighborhood every night. I don't know if you know what that sounds like. That were being traumatized by the flash bombs that police set off, that were being traumatized by the sirens that went off all night. You do realize that this was about the time that they were supposed to start school, that the kids were supposed to start school. I forgot to tell you about the tear gas and the smoke that was constantly in the air. That induces trauma. These young people, what some psychologists later found, were experiencing signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. Some were wetting the bed. I forgot to tell you that at the schools, early on, they weren't allowed to talk about what was happening in their neighborhood. I could see the reaction in you right now. Part of the issue was they said, we're not trained to hear all of this, which is all the more important, the work that you're doing. I had a certain kind of privilege, like Martin Luther King had privilege, like you have privilege. The news outlets, they love to talk to the PhD guy, the professor guy, the safe guy, the guy that wears a tie to the protest. They like that guy. That guy's an easy one to talk to. It's an easy one to talk to. Martin Luther King, he knew that the government would deal with the preacher guy, the nonviolent guy, the respectable leader guy. They knew that. He knew that. But King pressed the situation by using direct action to bolster his moral suasion. And that's the approach I tried to take. I tried to explain to people all over the world that the people of Ferguson, of St. Louis, had lost hope in law enforcement, had lost hope in government. My goal was to help people understand that this was a human reaction to a circumstance. That was my goal. While I did that, I was in the street at night because I wanted to disrupt. I wanted to disrupt so that decision makers would be unsettled enough to make policy changes, either through the democratic process or in the business community through their boards. And trust me when I say this, when I was out there, people would say, "Why are you hanging out with that kind of people?" People said, "Aren't those the Black Lives Matter people? Aren't they violent? Don't all lives matter?" I always said, "Prove it." I told you I'm not trying to get invited back. Colleagues had a lot to say, whether they said it out loud or communicated it through different forms. And this is important because they asked King, why was he hanging out with queer black communists and radical militants? He said, because they want freedom. You see, when you take action, that's how people talk to you, out of concern for you, of course. But King replied to those distractions in this way. This is what he said. He said, "There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but he must take it because his conscience tells him it is right." So the next thing I did is I used the resources I had, meaning the money and network that I had from my office. I was able to work with therapists who had contacted me from Kentucky and from Georgia, from Atlanta. They were coming up to Ferguson, and they wanted to go to the apartment complex where Michael Brown was killed to work with the people. I also worked with, and I hope you hear me clearly on this one, I also worked with the Association of Black Psychologists in St. Louis. My wife, who is a psychologist, has a PhD in counseling psychology. She was an officer at the time, and we worked together so that they could talk to the people in the complex. The people that they ended up talking to the most, of course, were women and largely mothers. And I realize I'm taking long, but I want you to be clear about this, what your work means. When these professional psychologists were speaking to the people in the Canfield-Garita apartment complex, speaking to these mothers, they talked about their inability to let their children play outside anymore. First, because a body laid on the ground, a dead body laid on the ground for 4.5 hours. Secondly, because there's all kinds of strangers in the neighborhood every day. Thirdly, because their children weren't sleeping at night and they were sleeping during the day. They talked about feeling unheard. I was never prouder of the work that professionals were doing when they went and did that work in the apartment complex. We hosted activists on my campus to have them share their issues with the students, and most of all, I made plain to my colleagues why this uprising, and that's what we call it, you know, the news calls it riots and all that kind of stuff. We call it uprising. Why this uprising, even more than scary, and that's how most people saw it, as scary, this uprising was an opportunity for change in the region and even my own educational institution. And so when activists and students decide to occupy my institution, and by occupy that means set up shop and camp out for 6 nights, I acted as a liaison between the activists and the administration and president of my university. I spoke with government officials at the federal, state, and local levels, as well as law enforcement leaders, as well as faith community leaders and business community leaders, about the need, check for me on this, the need to invest in youth on the front end instead of running around trying to fix broken windows and rebuild burned out buildings on the back end. Some of you caught it, some of you didn't. Either you pay on the front end or you pay on the back end, but you're paying. The Secretary of Education showed up, wanted to find out where Michael Brown went to school and all that kind of stuff. And so I asked him, do you intend to keep public education? And are we acting like it? I'm not sure I liked his answer, so I stole his pen. This is being filmed. Can you cut that part? Make sure, tell him, holler at me. I still got it. I still have his pen. But I told everybody I could the same way that I'm telling you today, the same thing that I'm telling you today, and that is we must address the question that one of today's greatest thinkers, Ibram X. Kendi, I don't know if you've heard of him, but you should check out his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He asks, are you racist or are you anti-racist? And he makes the charge that there's no such thing as being not racist. Either you're racist or you're anti-racist. Either you are for or against racism. There is no middle ground. There is no neutral ground. You rock for it or you rock against it. That's how it works. And so this is what we have to ask ourselves in the work that we're doing. As professional practitioners and decision makers, we have work to do. I don't need to tell you that your discipline, like nearly all the disciplines with the exceptions of ethnic studies, nearly all the disciplines that are featured in higher education did not start off as anti-racist. Am I boring you yet? Is anybody bored? They didn't start off that way. I don't need to tell you that. The roots of the psychological field, they have to be acknowledged as problematic in some ways. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. People like, maybe you've heard of G. Stanley Hall and some of the other progenitors of the field of psychology were clearly, and stop me if I'm lying. If I'm lying, I'm flying, right? We're clearly white supremacists. They were eugenicists. Their pseudoscientific ideas legitimized to a degree what will become the basis for forced sterilization and standardized tests and not to mention eventually mass incarceration. Your field, like the field of history or any one of these fields, early on established whiteness and maleness and straightness as normative and everything else as deviant or deficient and abnormal. And that was at the macro level. We didn't even talk about the micro level where the implicit bias and the explicit bias takes place. So how do you battle that history in your curriculum? I'm asking you right now, how do you battle that history in your curriculum? That's your job. You have to make a committed and intentional effort, listen to me, to decolonize. I know that's not popular with everybody. To decolonize the curriculum by challenging those old notions. And what does that look like? Let's break it down some. On your syllabus, do you find that you only teach men in your readings? Do you find that you only teach men of one race on your syllabi? Think to this. Think to this. This is what you can control. Remember, Martin King, control what he can control. I believe you have to look to those mental health professionals, and this is I want you to okay, well, let's go tenderly on this one. I believe we have to look to the mental health professionals of color whose identities, not always but often, inform their work, but also their commitment to their communities. We have to look to them and ask, how can we do better? Those professionals like King do their jobs all day and then start on their second and third jobs after they finish doing their primary job all day. Now, I'm asking you to engage with these professionals, but not to ask them to do your work for you. One of the things that happens, particularly with professionals of color in higher education, we, for whatever reason, have a way of doing a whole bunch of invisible work. I have to educate the students. I have to educate my colleagues. I have to educate the administration. They don't pay me enough, Jack. I want to live out here. So after you've done your work, maybe you still don't feel comfortable or competent in decolonizing your curriculum. This is what I say, decision makers, pay somebody to do it. Call the Association of Black Psychologists or others. Here again, I say, don't ask to be educated for free. Don't do that. Do your homework and be ready to learn. You know, with diversity, it's a funny thing. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a funny thing. Everybody, if I said, who loves diversity, equity, and inclusion, everybody would raise their hand. And I say, who pays for diversity, equity, and inclusion? You know, based on your own work, that the American Psychological Association has guidelines about addressing issues concerning marginalized people. So what does that look like for your spaces and for you? And so address this question if you could. For whom is therapy in theory and in praxis? For whom is therapy in theory and in praxis? The way it appears, therapy seems to be for a group of people who can afford it. I think that's a dangerous way to operate in a nation. There are many things that are occurring where mental health professionals could be useful, but people can't afford to operate in that way. Is there a possibility? Another question, and this is what the Queen Dean was talking about before. Is there a possibility that anyone is hurting from your teaching or your practice of psychology? This is a tough one. Like, this one kind of makes your stomach hurt a little bit. Is there a possibility that I'm hurting someone based on my inability to evolve my curriculum, my inability to read the most current literature? For instance, the Alliance of National Psychological Associations for Racial and Ethnic Equity put together a document called The Color of Justice, The Landscape of Traumatic Justice, Youth of Color in Conflict with the Law. And in this document, the Alliance calls for more attention to be paid to how mental health practices contribute to racial and ethnic disproportionality in the juvenile justice system. What a strange thought. And how that leads to damaging mental health effects for youth of color. The document points to the established finding that elevated scores on mental health screening instruments drive youth of color into, listen to me, drive youth of color into the juvenile justice system. The lack of culturally tailored, clinically valid, and reliable assessment, diagnosis, and intervention practices, and the failure to recognize and properly address the complex trauma-related behaviors for youth of color from multiple events outside of the juvenile justice system and inside are damaging. And so without any kind of ethnic-specific data on assessment or diagnosis and treatment effectiveness with racial and ethnic categories or subcategories, there's the potential for therapy to actually harm youth of color rather than help. This is why we have to be careful. This is why we have to do what the people call the work before we step into these fraught situations. Now, Mama Nash, if she said, I want you to come out here and be nice to the people. Don't come out here messing things up for us. I said, Mama Nash, do you know who I am? But seriously, if dealing with youth of color in the juvenile justice system, if that's too much, maybe we should start smaller. Let's start smaller. I know you all have seen it, and I shouldn't be talking about it up here, but did you see the movie What About Bob? The baby steps? That was my favorite part, the baby steps. Baby steps. So let's do the baby steps. Let's do the baby steps. You could tell this is how much I know about psychology. I watched What About Bob? Shame. How about this? When you get back, if you ever leave here, some of you I think are going to stay here forever, but if you should happen to go back to your job, I want you to do a scan of your office space. Do a visual scan of your office space. Put your binoculars on like that when you go back to your office space. I want you to walk in with fresh eyes. I want you and your team, call your team, walk in with fresh eyes. When you walk into the office, I want you to write down on a piece of paper, if I were a person of color, if I were a non-binary person, if I were a differently abled person, what about this office space would make me feel comfortable? From the pictures on the wall to the people greeting me, I want you to look at your website. Go on the interweb and look at your website. What about it would make me think that I need to go in that space to be safe? Small thing. Before even teaching or talking about or making decisions related to marginalized people, ask yourself, how do you know these people? I'm trying to get deep on you today. I'm going to ask you, how do you know black people? Do you know black people because of the work you've done in black communities? Or because of the friends you have? Or do you know black people because of the TV you watch? Or the radio you listen to? Or the books you read? This is an important part of everything because this allows us to check ourselves, to check our own minds. At one point in history, people thought some black people who lived in poverty had negative cognitive issues, when in fact they didn't. The people trapped in poverty were reacting quite naturally to the societal issues. I was talking to my fraternity brother last night about some spaces in urban America where they built these housing projects and people lived on top of each other with very few resources, and the elevator would go out. And people say, oh, those people are so violent. And all those people, no. You know what's violent? Is if you have people living on top of each other and don't provide civil services and the opportunity for housing, fair housing. That's violence. You have to think in terms of the societal impacts on the cognitive stability of people. This is an important element of everything. You all are decision makers, right? This is who we got today. That's it, the decision makers. Many of you all have budgets. I'll ask this as clearly as possible. What does your budget say about your values? Because that's what a budget is, right? Isn't it a value document? What does your budget say about your values? I told you before, everybody loves diversity, equity, and inclusion, but everybody wants somebody else to pay for it. You get what you pay for. If you believe in equity, diversity, and justice, how much money do you spend on it? Who do you hire? You're on these search committees, aren't you? Who do you hire? Bless you, bless you. Another question, do you pay women equally? Do you pay women of color equally? Simple questions. To what journals do you describe? And who do you pay for your in-service? These small things. Listen, I'm from Yakima, Washington. I'm proud of that. Most of you will never know where Yakima, Washington is. And I was reared by old people, okay? And they always said funny things like, let me see, I'm going to find out who's in here today. Let me find out. They always said funny things like, and I can't say them out loud, but they said things like, a hard head makes a soft. Did you know my parents? They say things like, and I'm telling you, trauma happened from all different directions. They say, you think I'm lying? Listen, they say things like, the more you cry, the less you, nobody knows that one, the less you myconate or urinate. And so they'd have me sobbing, and my mama would say, the more you cry, the less you pee. I was wrong. It was my fault. But I figured if I cried, I'd get out of it. It didn't work. It didn't work. But they had some very profound sayings when I was growing up around these black Southerners who lived through Jim Crow, who fought for freedom and justice. They went to the church house and they fed the children of the neighborhood, not because they were getting an award for it, but because that's what they were supposed to do. One of the things that I remember them saying is that time spends better than money. Time spends better than money. And so the question is, when you look at your 24 hours in a day, what does it say about your commitment to justice? When you look at the 168 hours in a week, what does it say about your desires to make things better, for progress? Black youth have the fastest growing rate of suicide. For us to deal with it, if we believe in equity, that is, it's going to require doing extra work. There's just no other way around it. Just as Martin King, we forget this, had one job. He was the pastor of a church. First Dexter Avenue and then his daddy's church, Ebenezer Baptist. That was his job. He could have did that, came home and kissed the babies, and that's the end of the game. But he did that extra work. I got a baby girl. She's fixing to make 6 years old. She's bad and bougie. And she requires a lot. Sometimes I think I have no time. But I say, thank goodness that Martin King, that Coretta Scott King, that so many others, psychologists like Kenneth and Mamie Clark, that they did extra work, that they went above and beyond to try to find freedom and justice for us. This is what I'm calling on you to do. This is the challenge for today, is to figure out how to use your time towards the things you value. How to use, and I'm closing. This is the real closing. How do you use your privilege to create access and success for others? Nobody wants you to give away your privilege. Nobody wants that. But how do you use it to open a door for somebody else? How do you use it to make sure that 50 years from now we don't have to see, well, I'll not be here, but our kids, our grandkids don't have to see the foolishness we're seeing right now? How are you spending your time? How are you using your resources How are you employing your privilege? People did it for me in the past, and I'm eternally grateful. And I'm grateful to you for listening. Thank you so much.